Welcome to this discussion of Betaine and how it might influence your performance in hot conditions. On our channel, we explore supplements from a critical perspective, looking past bold marketing to the underlying evidence. Heat makes exercise harder by raising your core temperature and challenging your ability to stay hydrated. Some supplement companies claim that betaine, a compound found in beets, spinach, and other foods, can keep you cool and hydrated when temperatures rise. In this presentation, we're going to break down how the body responds to heat, the biological roles of betaine, and the limited human data on whether it actually helps. By the end, you'll have a clear understanding of where betaine fits and which strategies are truly effective when you're training or competing in hot environments. For our second slide, we pose a simple but important question. Can betaine help you train harder in the heat, or is this claim mainly driven by marketing? Athletes often struggle with fatigue and dehydration when working out in hot conditions. As your body sweats to cool itself, you lose fluids and electrolytes. Your heart rate climbs and you start feeling exhausted sooner than you would in a cooler environment. Marketers sometimes suggest that adding betaine to your pre-workout or hydration drink will somehow prevent these problems, promising superior hydration and improved endurance. Before you invest in another supplement, let's examine whether the evidence supports these claims. Over the next few slides, we'll outline the physiological challenges of exercising in the heat and the roles betaine might play, then review the actual research behind these promises. In hot environments, your body's core temperature climbs and heat stress reduces your capacity for prolonged exercise. Dehydration further compounds this by diminishing blood volume and reducing the amount of oxygen your muscles receive. To mitigate these effects, some companies promote betaine as a cellular hydration agent that can keep you cool, hydrated, and performing at your best. They argue that because betaine influences cell water content in laboratory settings, it must also protect athletes against heat fatigue. It's easy to be swayed by phrases like osmolyte support or molecular chaperone on a label, but such terms don't automatically translate to meaningful results in human performance. In this presentation, we'll compare marketing language with what happens inside your body when you exercise in heat, and we'll scrutinize whether supplementing with betaine changes those outcomes. In hot weather or high humidity, your body struggles to dissipate the heat generated by working muscles. As a result, your core temperature rises steadily during exercise. To release excess heat, blood flow is redirected toward the skin, causing your heart to beat faster to maintain both skin and muscle perfusion. If your core temperature climbs unchecked, your perception of effort increases and you fatigue more quickly. In extreme cases, hyperthermia can lead to heat illness. Understanding how core temperature responds to exercise in the heat is crucial, because any supplement claiming to improve heat tolerance must demonstrate an ability to blunt this rise. Throughout this discussion, we'll look at whether betaine has shown any measurable effect on core temperature in human studies. Another major challenge during exercise in hot environments is fluid loss through sweat. Sweating is your body's primary means of cooling, but the fluid originates from extracellular compartments and ultimately pulls water from within cells. As you sweat heavily, you lose not only water but also electrolytes like sodium, chloride, and potassium. If you don't replace these losses, you become dehydrated, which reduces plasma volume, thickens the blood, and stresses the cardiovascular system. Supplement companies sometimes imply that betaine can counteract this process by acting as an osmolyte. But the key strategy for combating sweat loss remains proper hydration and electrolyte replacement. We'll explore whether there's evidence that adding betaine helps to preserve fluid balance beyond what can be achieved with water and electrolytes alone. Heat and dehydration impose significant strain on your cardiovascular system. When you're dehydrated, plasma volume decreases and blood becomes more viscous, forcing the heart to work harder to pump it. At the same time, blood flow is diverted to the skin to aid cooling, which reduces the supply of oxygenated blood to your working muscles. These changes raise heart rate and reduce stroke volume, leading to a drop in cardiac output and oxygen delivery. Consequently, your muscles fatigue more quickly and your overall performance declines. It's important to recognize that any ingredient promising to improve heat tolerance should be evaluated for its ability to attenuate this cardiovascular strain. We'll consider whether betaine has shown any measurable impact on heart rate, blood volume, or oxygen delivery during heat stress. Dehydration and hyperthermia accelerate the onset of fatigue. As plasma volume shrinks, stroke volume decreases and heart rate must rise to maintain cardiac output. Your perception of effort increases and you may experience dizziness, muscle cramps, and mental fog. In this state, your body may be forced to reduce intensity or stop altogether to protect itself. Maintaining hydration and core temperature through fluid intake, electrolytes, and cooling strategies is essential for keeping fatigue at bay. Supplementing with betaine is sometimes suggested as an additional strategy, but its impact on delaying fatigue has not been consistently demonstrated. We'll discuss whether small changes in fluid balance or cellular protection translate into a meaningful delay in fatigue under real-world conditions. Before we evaluate its effects on performance, it's worth taking a moment to understand what betaine is. Betaine is a naturally occurring compound also known as trimethylglycine because its structure is glycine with 3 methyl groups attached. It's found in many foods such as beets, spinach, shellfish, and whole grains, and your body can produce it from choline. In the diet, typical intake is relatively low, fractions of a gram per day, whereas supplements provide doses in the range of 2 grams or more. Betaine is widely used as an additive in animal feed, and has also been explored for its roles in liver and cardiovascular health. When it appears in pre-workout products, it's usually included in gram quantities far above what you'd get from food. Understanding this context helps us appreciate the difference between dietary sources and supplemental doses when assessing potential effects. In addition to its osmotic properties, betaine serves as an important methyl donor. In metabolic pathways, methyl groups are used to activate or deactivate compounds, and betaine donates a methyl group to convert homocysteine into methionine. This reaction helps maintain healthy homocysteine levels and supports the synthesis of other molecules including creatine and carnitine. Creatine is critical for rapid energy production in muscle, while carnitine plays a role in fatty acid transport into mitochondria. Because of these roles, some researchers have speculated that supplemental betaine could indirectly enhance performance by influencing methylation-dependent pathways. It's a plausible mechanism, but the real question is whether providing extra betaine actually leads to measurable changes in performance or resilience during heat stress. The research to date provides only limited answers. Perhaps the most frequently cited reason for adding betaine to heat performance formulas is its function as an osmolyte. Osmolytes are small molecules that organisms accumulate to balance osmotic pressures when exposed to high salinity, dehydration, or heat. In both plants and animals, betaine helps replace inorganic salts like sodium and chloride in cells under hypertonic conditions. This replacement protects proteins and enzymes from denaturation and helps maintain cell volume without disrupting normal cellular function. In theory, if betaine accumulates in human tissues, it could help cells cope with the osmotic stress caused by sweating and dehydration. However, it's one thing to observe osmolyte effects in cultured cells or animal studies, and another to show that ingesting betaine leads to meaningful changes in human tissues during exercise in the heat. To understand osmolyte function, it's helpful to recall basic concepts of cellular osmolarity. Osmolarity is the concentration of solutes in a fluid. When the extracellular fluid becomes hypertonic, meaning it has a higher solute concentration than the inside of the cell, water leaves the cell, leading to cell shrinkage. This can disrupt enzyme function and damage cellular structures. Cells respond by accumulating compatible osmolytes such as betaine, taurine, and sorbitol, which increase intracellular osmolarity without interfering with normal biochemical processes. By balancing osmolarity on both sides of the membrane, cells can maintain volume and continue functioning. In the context of exercise in the heat, the question is whether orally consuming betaine elevates intracellular osmolyte levels to an extent that would actually influence whole body fluid balance or performance. Research in humans has yet to confirm this. When you exercise in the heat, sweating draws water from the extracellular space to cool your body. To maintain plasma volume, your body pulls water from within cells, reducing intracellular volume. If this process continues unchecked, cellular dehydration can impair enzyme activity, protein stability, and membrane integrity. In theory, accumulating compatible osmolytes like betaine could help cells avoid this damage by drawing water back into the cell and stabilizing proteins. Some animal studies and cell culture experiments support this protective role. However, oral supplementation must overcome several obstacles. Betaine must be absorbed, transported into cells, and retained in sufficient concentrations. There is little evidence that typical supplement doses achieve this during exercise, and human trials have not demonstrated clear effects on intracellular volume or performance in the heat. Heat stress and dehydration place a dual burden on the body. Elevated temperature can cause proteins to unfold, triggering the production of heat shock proteins that act as molecular chaperones. Dehydration introduces osmotic stress, potentially destabilizing proteins and membranes. Laboratory research has shown that betaine can stabilize proteins and membranes under these stresses, acting as a molecular chaperone of its own. In cell and animal models, betaine has been observed to protect enzymes in membranes from denaturation during heat and osmotic stress. These findings are intriguing and underpin many of the claims made by supplement companies. However, it's a long leap from observing protective effects in cells to demonstrating improved endurance or strength in exercising humans. The next slides will explore whether any human studies have validated this theory. On paper, the mechanistic rationale for betaine is compelling. If a compound can stabilize proteins, maintain membrane integrity, and support fluid balance, it could, in theory, improve heat tolerance. Betaine transporters like BGT1 are upregulated in response to hypertonic stress, suggesting that our cells recognize and use betaine when conditions demand it. Because of these observations, some researchers hypothesized that chronically elevated betaine levels from supplementation might help athletes handle thermal and osmotic stress better. However, mechanistic plausibility does not guarantee real-world benefits. Many compounds show promising effects in vitro, but fail to translate to meaningful improvements in human performance. That's why controlled studies in athletes are essential before accepting marketing claims. The next section will examine what those studies have actually found. A key determinant of performance in the heat is your ability to maintain plasma volume. Plasma volume supports cardiac output by ensuring adequate stroke volume, and it facilitates skin blood flow for cooling. When dehydration causes plasma volume to fall, stroke volume declines and your heart rate must rise to maintain cardiac output. This makes exercise feel harder and accelerates fatigue. Plasma volume also affects thermoregulation. With less blood available to transport heat to the skin, core temperature rises more quickly. For these reasons, sports scientists look closely at interventions that might preserve plasma volume. Betaine's alleged osmolyte properties have led to the idea that it might defend plasma volume during heat stress. We'll see that the evidence for such effects in humans is currently limited and inconsistent. Because plasma volume and temperature are so important, proven strategies for managing them should always be your foundation. Drinking fluids early and often maintains total body water and supports sweating, including electrolytes, particularly sodium, helps replace minerals lost in sweat, and preserves osmotic balance. Cooling strategies like wearing ice vests, using cold towels, taking cold showers, or resting in shade can reduce your thermal load and lower core temperature. Acclimating gradually to heat by training in warm conditions also improves your body's ability to handle heat stress. These approaches have strong evidence behind them and should be prioritized. If you're considering betaine, it should complement, not replace, these core strategies. Without proper hydration and cooling, no supplement will save you from the effects of extreme heat. Many supplement companies use mechanistic language to imply that betaine can protect against fluid loss. They highlight its role as an osmolyte and suggest that it can help retain intracellular water and thereby preserve plasma volume during heat stress. These claims are appealing because athletes are always looking for an edge in challenging conditions. However, translating basic science into performance benefits requires controlled human studies. Before we can say that betaine preserves fluid balance or improves performance, we must see evidence that supplementing with betaine changes physiological markers like plasma volume, sweat rate, body water content, heart rate, and core temperature in exercising humans. The next few slides summarize the handful of human studies that have attempted to test these claims. In 2023, researchers published a study in which participants consumed betaine for a week and then underwent passive heat exposure. The idea was to see whether chronic betaine supplementation would improve tolerance to heat when participants were placed in a hot environment. This study found no significant differences between betaine and placebo groups in core temperature, skin temperature, or plasma volume during passive heat exposure. In other words, consuming betaine did not help participants stay cooler or maintain blood volume under these conditions. The authors concluded that betaine offered no benefit for passive heat tolerance. These findings challenge the notion that betaine supplementation meaningfully influences how the body copes with heat without exercise, and they cast doubt on its use as a standalone heat tolerance aid. A review published in 2020 discussed the possibility that chronic betaine intake could enhance heat tolerance. The authors noted that betaine acts as a molecular chaperone and osmolyte in various organisms, which could theoretically stabilize proteins and membranes in humans during heat stress. However, they emphasized that at the time, evidence in humans was largely absent, and that most data came from animal and cell culture studies. The review concluded that while the theory was intriguing, human trials were necessary before recommending betaine as a heat-tolerant supplement. This perspective reminds us that mechanistic plausibility should not be conflated with proven efficacy. The limited number of human studies since that review underscores how little is currently known about betaine's effects in hot exercise conditions. In 2024, a small pilot study tested whether preloading betaine could influence responses to exercise in the heat. Cyclists consume betaine for several days and then perform cycling sessions in a hot environment. Researchers monitored core temperature, sweat rate, and other physiological variables. They reported that betaine preloading was associated with a slightly smaller increase in core temperature and a higher sweat rate compared with placebo. Total body water appeared to trend higher in the betaine group, though the difference did not reach statistical significance. These results suggest that betaine might influence thermoregulatory responses, perhaps by encouraging more sweating or altering fluid balance. However, the study involved a small number of participants and did not measure performance outcomes directly. As such, it provides an interesting signal that warrants further research rather than definitive evidence. An older study from 2008 explored betaine's role in rehydration after dehydration. Participants exercised to dehydrate themselves and then drank fluids with or without betaine. Those who consumed betaine exhibited greater increases in plasma volume and changes in metabolic markers like oxygen consumption and plasma lactate. Interestingly, subjective thermal sensation improved, suggesting participants felt cooler or more comfortable. However, when researchers tested sprint performance after rehydration, there were no significant differences between the betaine and control groups. This suggests that while betaine might influence fluid distribution and certain metabolic responses, those changes did not translate into improved short-term performance. Again, the results point to a complex picture in which betaine has subtle physiological effects, but may not deliver the performance gains that marketers advertise. When we consider all the available human data on betaine and heat performance, the picture is inconsistent and incomplete. The passive heat stress study found no benefits. The rehydration study showed some fluid-related effects, but no performance improvement. The exercise and heat pilot suggested modest thermoregulatory changes but was too small to draw firm conclusions. Reviews continue to stress that the evidence base is sparse and that more controlled trials are needed. There's also wide variation in dosing protocols, duration of supplementation, and exercise conditions across studies, which makes comparisons difficult. Taken together, the existing evidence does not support broad claims that betaine improves endurance or strength in hot environments. At best, there may be subtle effects on hydration or thermoregulation that need to be verified in larger, well-designed trials. One argument for betaine is that even small reductions in core temperature could prolong time to exhaustion, because high core temperature is a known limiter of endurance. That's a reasonable hypothesis, but the human studies we've discussed have not consistently shown that betaine actually lowers core temperature during exercise. Even when the cycling pilot observed a modest reduction, the effect size was small and its impact on performance was not tested. Furthermore, core temperature is just one part of the heat stress equation. Heart rate, plasma volume, sweat rate, and subjective feelings of heat also play critical roles. Without consistent, clinically meaningful reductions in core temperature across studies, it's premature to assume that betaine will help you go longer in the heat. Focus instead on proven cooling and hydration strategies, which have been shown to lower core temperature more reliably. Athletic performance in the heat depends on many factors, including hydration status, electrolyte balance, acclimation, clothing, environmental conditions, fitness level, and genetics. For example, athletes who are well hydrated and acclimated to heat can tolerate higher temperatures better than those who are not. Wearing breathable clothing and minimizing solar exposure also helps. There's no single magic bullet, and certainly no supplement that can override these basic determinants. Betaine may provide subtle cellular protection, but it cannot replace the need to drink water, consume electrolytes, use cooling strategies, or train progressively in hot conditions to improve your heat tolerance. An effective plan for performing in the heat must address all these elements holistically. That's why our channel emphasizes evidence-based strategies rather than relying on marketing promises. Given the mixed and limited evidence, it's important to manage expectations when considering betaine for heat performance. Betaine should not replace water or sodium in your hydration plan, nor should it substitute for sensible cooling methods like seeking shade or using ice. The best case scenario is that betaine might offer some modest cellular protection or help maintain fluid balance in specific conditions. However, most studies have not shown performance benefits, and some have shown no measurable physiological effects at all. The safest approach is to view betaine as a potentially interesting but optional add-on. Before investing in a supplement, prioritize more impactful actions such as acclimating to heat, staying hydrated, consuming electrolytes, and using cooling strategies to manage core temperature and reduce cardiovascular strain. Even if you decide to experiment with betaine, proper hydration and electrolyte intake must remain your top priorities. Start each session well hydrated by consuming fluids throughout the day, and drink water or sports drinks regularly during exercise. Replace electrolytes lost in sweat by including sodium, and if needed, potassium, calcium, and magnesium in your fluid intake. When sweat rates are very high, a sports drink with carbohydrate and sodium can help sustain energy and fluid absorption. On particularly hot days, plan for scheduled cooling breaks, make use of ice towels or cooling garments, and use fan or evaporative cooling between efforts. These measures have repeatedly been shown to maintain plasma volume, lower core temperature, and improve performance. Supplements like Betaine may complement these strategies, but they cannot substitute for them. Betaine is generally considered safe and is widely available in health foods and pre-workout supplements. If you enjoy using it and can verify that your product provides an adequate dose, you may experiment with it as part of a comprehensive heat management plan. However, it should never be your primary heat performance tool. Use it only after you've addressed hydration, electrolytes, acclimation, and cooling. Because human studies have shown inconsistent results, it's wise to approach Betaine with curiosity and caution rather than high expectations. Track your own responses and remember that what works for one person may not work for another. Ultimately, Betaine is best viewed as an optional extra that might confer subtle benefits, not as a substitute for foundational heat tolerance strategies. It's important to acknowledge that Betaine is not a fictitious or invented compound. It is a legitimate osmolyte with well-defined biochemical functions. Plants and marine animals accumulate betaine to protect against drought and high salinity. In these organisms, betaine stabilizes proteins and membranes and helps maintain cell volume under osmotic stress. Scientists have also observed similar protective effects in human cell cultures. These findings explain why betaine remains a subject of interest in nutrition and physiology research. However, the presence of a clear mechanism does not automatically translate into performance benefits when you ingest betaine. Differences in dose, tissue accumulation, and metabolic pathways mean that what happens in isolated cells or non-human models may not replicate in an exercising human body. Recognizing this distinction helps you appreciate the science without overestimating its practical impact. Supplement marketing often gets ahead of the science, and Betaine is no exception. Product labels may feature phrases like enhances thermoregulation or supports cellular hydration to suggest that taking Betaine will make you immune to heat-induced fatigue. But as we've seen, the human data are limited and mixed. Most studies have found no improvements in performance, and the few that hint at physiological effects have not demonstrated clear advantages in real-world conditions. It's wise to read marketing claims with a critical eye and to look for evidence from peer-reviewed studies rather than solely relying on promotional language. By staying informed, you can avoid spending money on supplements that offer little benefit and instead invest your resources in strategies with proven effectiveness. To conclude, betaine is an interesting compound with genuine biochemical roles as a methyl donor and osmolyte. Animal and cell studies suggest it can stabilize proteins and membranes during thermal and osmotic stress, which has led to speculation that it might help athletes perform better in the heat. However, human research to date is limited and inconsistent. Passive heat exposure experiments show no benefits. Rehydration studies suggest some fluid-related effects without performance gains, and small exercise pilots offer preliminary but inconclusive results. Meanwhile, factors like hydration, electrolyte balance, acclimation, and cooling have demonstrated and reliable impacts on heat performance. As you plan your training and competition in hot conditions, focus on these proven strategies first. If you choose to experiment with betaine, treat it as a small optional addition and monitor your own responses rather than expecting dramatic improvements.